Excellent. Good morning. Is one of the two organizers of this conference. Um, just so you know a little bit about my background, prior to that, I've spent a lot of time working for McKinsey and Company as a consultant in Russia and in South Africa, focusing on the power sector. And I've also got a bit of an economic development background. So all of that influences kind of the way that I look at things and how I approach energy storage. So today, really maybe four kind of objectives. One is to look at an overview of what's going on in the world, again, outside of China, of vanadium redox battery companies, and show you some examples of the activities and companies that we are seeing. Likewise, I want to do an overview and show some examples of actual installations of battery projects. And third, I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the supply chain. So not the actual systems, not the actual companies, but rather provision of components and pieces of the puzzle to make a vanadium redox flow battery, and what's going on again in that sense outside of China. And then finally, I want to also touch upon what's happening in the regulatory environment that is enabling the development of vanadium redox flow batteries and their supply chains in regions outside of China. There's a lot going on in China. And so again, I wanted to kind of give an overview on all of these outside of China. And then obviously I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes for some Q&A. So I just want to stress that this is not meant to be an exhaustive presentation. I'm trying to actually be broad rather than detailed. And later on, there will be individuals and companies that will be offering much more detailed perspective on their regions, on their businesses. And so this is meant to be more of an overview. And if I, so please think of it that way. So then let's get into it. If we can look at the map of the world where we see activities of vanadium redox flow battery companies, where they're actually located, it's quite broad. It is kind of focused maybe in four regions, which is Asia, Europe, North America, and Australia. And I'm going to go and talk through a few examples of these companies, just as indicators of what's been happening more recently. So I'm going to avoid things that are 10 years old and really talk about maybe the last couple of years. So one, which is quite interesting. There's a company in the U.S. that has just finished they raised about $10 million through more of a crowdfunding approach. A company called Storin, and they're actually interesting because they're starting from a residential battery approach. A lot of vanadium redox battery companies don't look at that market. I think part of it is the size of the systems, but they're actually starting with that. And their promise is to start off by supplying those 8,000 individual investors with residential systems in the U.S. Another example in the U.S. is a company called Stryten Energy. They actually purchased a company, a startup, a vanadium battery startup called Storion Energy last year in 2022. Stryten itself is a bigger company with about 2,500 employees in North America, and they do lithium batteries, they do lead acid batteries, and I think their approach was to basically add a long duration technology to their portfolio. In Europe, we're seeing a company called Arbonia. They've got a number of subsidiaries, and they're also fairly large, about 6,500 employees. They developed vanadium redox battery themselves. They from scratch, and also interestingly enough, they focus on the residential market. The company has a lot of expertise in kind of cooling and heating systems indoors, so they're trying to leverage that, and their distribution lines to basically get in. Their focus right now is in Switzerland and kind of Germany in the European market. But again, interesting to see a player coming in, starting off with a residential segment rather than commercial or large scale. A company that is well known for those of us in the vanadium industry is AMG. And they'll actually pop up a few times on this. They're kind of more, I think, known as a vanadium producer. They produce other metals as well. They're quite known for for taking kind of spent materials and producing minerals such as vanadium out of that. It's interesting that they kind of developed their own system. They bought an integrator, and they've basically established a battery business which they call AMG LIVA, and you can see that LIVA stands for lithium and vanadium. Basically, they've designed a hybrid system which uses a combination of lithium batteries and vanadium redox flow batteries together to provide a storage solution. And they're rolling this out at their own facilities, and according to their own filings, they've energized their first such battery in 2022. This is an example, similar maybe in some ways to Bushveld, of a company in the vanadium space already as a producer and processor, going down the value chain and developing a battery business. And that's, again, very recent developments in 2022. Turning to Asia. There's a company out of South Korea, which has been around for actually quite a while. It's called H2, and I think for them, the big announcement is that they've raised $18 million. Again, I think that's an example of capital flowing in. So this is more of a startup company, and to date, they've raised now $42 million. So this is, again, an example of activities by companies in raising capital. I think it just shows that there's still quite a bit of interest in VRFBs. Another example of that interest is a company called VFlowTech out of Singapore, and they raised $10 million just recently in Series A funding. So obviously their raise to date is much less than H2. They're in earlier stages, and their goal is to use that capital for R&D to scale up some manufacturing and ensure a few more markets, such as Turkey, the US, Japan, and India. And then I wanted to give an example of a company in Australia, also a startup, also recently raised a very small amount, 5 million Australian dollars, but you got to start somewhere. And the investment to them is basically coming through. It's a bit of a complicated structure, but it's similar in some ways that there's to what Bushveld has done. In the sense that they've got an investor who is also developing a vanadium mine in Australia. So we can see that there's actually quite a bit of different activities. Some companies that are bigger that are entering the industry. Some are startups, that have been quite successful in raising capital. But I think all of that are positive news, and it's quite spread out geographically. So let's move on to point number two, which are some examples of recent battery installations and projects. Again, you can see here that there's quite a spread. I think every single populated continent is covered, with examples all over the world. I won't cover all of the vanadium batteries. There's a database that Vanitech has on its website that is managed by Texas A&M University, and there's hundreds of installations that you can see there in terms of where they are. But I will touch upon some of the more recent ones that, again, highlight where the industry is going or where deployments are going outside of China. So one example is that Infinity, which is a company listed in the UK, with kind of offices, headquarters in both the UK and in Canada. They've supplied a 4.5 megawatt hour battery that's part of a solar and storage project in Canada, and it's paired with a fairly large solar PV array. In Japan, we saw Sumitomo recently commission a 51 megawatt hour vanadium dioxide battery in Hokkaido with the utility HEPCO. That's interesting because that was a follow-up project. Their first large battery with HEPCO was in 2015, which was a 60 megawatt hour system. It's always nice to have repeat business. It shows that their technology is working, and vanadium dioxide batteries are in demand. So that was probably the largest vanadium battery that was installed outside of China, and now Sumitomo's kind of done it twice in the northern island in Japan, in Hokkaido. In India, there's a couple of smaller companies that are operating. I think the one that's kind of growing the most is Electric, and they've delivered a number of vanadium batteries into India, and they've also started manufacturing for export. The Spanish company E22 also deployed a smaller 250 kilowatt hour battery in India and in Hyderabad as well. So we're seeing India start to deploy vanadium batteries. There used to be a company called Dia that did flow batteries in India, and I think there's always kind of been a more receptive attitude there as a result. But it's also a market where we're seeing storage grow quite a bit. And vanadium batteries are part of that, although they're still very small systems. I haven't monitored any like megawatt size installations in India. In South Africa, which is also kind of a market that is just starting to take off on the storage side. And here I can speak from personal experience because Bushveld is developed this project. It's now under construction, and we hope to have within a few months operational a solar and vanadium battery mini grid. It's 3.5 megawatts of solar and a 4 megawatt hour battery from CellCube. What's interesting about this mini grid is it's actually was not purchased by the customer. So the customer is a mine, and they're just buying the electricity. The system itself, the battery and the mini grid, are owned by a special purpose vehicle, and it's financed independently. So it's not using the mine's money at all. The mine just basically pays the electricity. And so we structured it that there's actually debt funding into the project. And then there's equity, with Bushveld being a minority investor. So I think it's quite interesting because it not only shows kind of the use case for vanadium batteries in South Africa, but it also shows the bankability of solar and batteries, that there's banks interested and willing to, if structured correctly, put in capital, put in debt to support projects that use the technology already. In Spain, there's a project that was announced by Largo Clean Energy. That's the energy subsidiary of Largo, which is a vanadium producer with listed in the U.S. And with operations in Brazil. And they've announced just a slightly over 6 megawatt hour battery that will be installed in Spain with Enel. And that battery will also be coupled with a solar array, basically to shift when that energy is used versus when it's produced by the solar plant. quite a few things being done in the UK by Invinity, which I've already mentioned. It's a pretty interesting project that they have 1.8 megawatt hours, a battery that is together with a hydrogen facility and tied to tidal power generation. So it's kind of more of a test facility and a research facility, but there's an actual use case for the battery to work with a combination of technologies, and I think that that's quite exciting. And then on top of that, Invinity's also announced an MOU with Dawson Group to rent out batteries. They've sold a small one and are assessing a much larger deployment opportunity with them. And then there's a few things happening in the US. I can't even list all of them. One is that CellCube installed an 8 megawatt hour system in the state of Illinois to a company called GW Electric, and it's part of also of a mini grid that has different technologies. It has a solar array, it has a flywheel. GW is doing quite a bit of integration and using their own expertise to pull all of these technologies together, both to self-supply and to be able to actually participate in some market opportunities as well. Invinity announced that they've won a tender in California to Indian Energy, and that will be a 10 megawatt hour battery. Interestingly enough, it was a long duration tender, so lithium was excluded from that. And so vanadium redox battery was one of the awarded projects. And then H2, who I've spoken about previously as having successfully raised some capital and are located in South Korea, they've announced a 20 megawatt hour project in California to be completed either later this year or at some point next year. So quite a few things. Sumitomo, for example, have had their system in California operating for a few years, and there's some data on how it's performed. So there's quite a lot going on in the US. I think the insights here is none of these, that there's things going on almost in every single country, especially the larger energy storage markets, even some that are emerging. And maybe the other insight is that none of these systems are really very large if you compare it with some of the size of the systems in operation and under development in China. So I think there's a lot of different manufacturers also involved, but those are some of the insights in terms of what's going on outside of China. And really, if you take out the couple of installations by Sumitomo in Japan, really all the systems are sub 20 megawatt hours. I think that's going to increase in terms of size, but at the moment it's kind of very much on that uptick in terms of size of installations. So then let's talk about the supply chain, because I think that is a little bit of a limitation as to why bigger systems aren't yet going up outside of China. The supply chain is limited. The ability to source electrolyte and the actual manufacturing of VRFBs and how much capacity there is, it's increasing, but it's still quite limited. And I wanted to maybe share some examples of that growth. There's actually quite a bit going on in Australia. The Beko Group have announced that they're starting construction of a 9 million liter electrolyte plant in Townsville, and that's very, very recent. North Harbour and CellCube have announced that they're starting a feasibility study to make the batteries in Australia, and a couple of other companies that are, I would say, exploration companies have announced that as part of their work to mine vanadium, they're gonna focus on production of high purity oxide. And an example of that is LE Systems, a Japanese technology company, working with TMG to test how their feedstock can work into making electrolyte. I don't have as many examples in Germany, but AMG has announced that they're going to build a 6 million liter vanadium electrolyte plant in Germany, Nuremberg as well. So now you can see how in Germany and in Australia, there's going to be capacity to produce. A lot of stuff going on in Saudi Arabia, a country I haven't touched upon yet. AMG announced a $200 million gasification project in Saudi Arabia, and that will make both vanadium oxide in Saudi Arabia and electrolyte together. So there'll be a manufacturing plant for each one. We've seen Electric sign a distribution manufacturing agreement, which they think can be scaled to gigawatt level. And then, the last one is it's a few years old, but we're actually going to get an update later on in the session on this, where Schmidt and a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco have signed kind of a joint venture to build a manufacturing facility for VRFBs in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is an example of where a number of companies are kind of been attracted and invited to do different things. And there's also some domestic supply of vanadium that could be used to produce feedstock for electrolyte. In South Africa, Bushveld has just actually completed construction, as I said, of an 8 million liter electrolyte plant, which is the largest one at the moment outside of China. So you can see we've got Australia building electrolyte capacity, Europe building electrolyte capacity, South Africa building electrolyte capacity. We've also announced an expansion in our own manufacturing of electrolyte in our Van Camp facility, which makes high purity oxide, and we think that we can actually increase that further. And we've also, similar to what you saw in Australia, have started work on manufacturing VRFBs in country with the Industrial Development Corporation. And then in the US, also quite a bit of work on the supply chain. US Vanadium has announced an expansion of their facility to make electrolyte. Sumitomo stated they're going to invest between $7 and $8 million to make a facility to manufacture VRFBs in the US. Which is quite interesting given that their kind of origins are out of Japan. And so this is kind of their focus market going forward. And then we've seen some innovation on the financing side with Largo launching their physical vanadium fund to own vanadium as a physical asset and electrolyte as a physical asset. So not as many countries covered here in terms of supply chain, but certainly still fairly good geographic spread. A lot of it focusing on either electrolyte capacity or VRFB manufacturing. Probably still not at the scale of facilities that are in China. If we, for example, compare to Dalian's facility to make vanadium chemicals in Dalian, Dalian Holding Groups, they're still quite small, but they're no longer tiny. They're no longer just a few 100,000 liters. The capacity in the supply chain is growing. And then finally, I wanted to touch upon some regulatory trends in these different regions across the world. You can see that this map is not even less shaded than the previous one, but there's still some interesting activities. In Australia, that electrolyte plant that I mentioned has some government grant support, and it's part of a larger facility of $75 million in Australia that's looking at minerals and establishing mineral production in South Africa of key minerals. And vanadium is actually the first one that they're focusing on, which I feel is quite interesting. In Canada, in the province of Alberta, there's basically an emissions reduction Alberta Act, and that's providing capital to research making electrolyte out of some deposits in Canada. And we've also seen some R&D grants for mining and processing to exploration companies out of Quebec, which is another province in Canada. The US has made vanadium, designated vanadium as a critical material, not only in its kind of construction and defense applications, but also because of energy storage. We've seen procurement in California, which was not vanadium battery specific, but it excluded lithium ion, which obviously made the vanadium redox battery a lot more competitive. And we expect a lot more to come out of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of how it will help technologies, specifically in long duration, which should also be quite positive for VRFBs as well. Again, how that act is going to operate is still being laid out, but there's a lot of excitement on how that's going to benefit disproportionately technologies such as vanadium redox flow. And in the EU, there's really not a policy yet. I think there's an expectation that this Green Deal industrial plan that is meant to be a response to what the US has done with the IRA will similarly include grants or support or guidelines that will enable long duration storage and VRFBs. It's interesting that in Europe, there's already an industry association for Flow Batteries Europe, and that does kind of help create a voice for technologies that are VRFBs and very similar. So not as much going on this space. So it does kind of show that the private sector is moving forward. So then maybe let me just draw 3 conclusions from this. And yes, it should be 3, even though the last one says 4. So while the majority of vanadium battery sites and kind of supply chain activities in the world, I think, are happening in China, whether that's 90% or 95%, it's a vast majority. However, there's still a lot of non-China based activities. And if you think of the number of vanadium battery companies and how many are pursuing, small systems, it actually might even be more going on in those specific niches of the sector outside of China, especially if you look at like residential batteries. 2, I think every region is seeing activities by vanadium battery companies and the supply chain. And if you compare 2022 to 2021, it's a massive uptick. And I think that trend is going to continue going forward. And I think it's important to have the supply chain because you cannot have large batteries without having supply chains. And some of that can be exported out of China, but you need to have supply chains that are closer, given how much more expensive shipping is and how much longer shipping times are than they were pre-pandemic. And so it's good to see multiple established companies, with thousands of employees entering the VRFB space. I think they're bringing in expertise and capabilities into the industry. And then finally, I think that the policy side really does lag what China and the Chinese government has done, for the last 5 to 8 years. There are some exceptions. I think Australia and Canada are the best that are starting to focus specifically on vanadium and vanadium-based storage, but they're really the exception. The US, I think, is also starting to realize this, but all of them kind of lag behind China, and the vast majority of countries where you actually still see private sector actually don't have any specific policies that are favorable for vanadium or VRFBs. It's good to see the private sector moving, but they're doing it without really much support. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, I can try to address those now.
Thanks. 所以有问题。
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mikhail. Yeah, it's a great report. A lot of informations for out of China I got. You talk about the supply chain of VRB, and but I think the supply chain about VRB is not only include electrolyte. It's about carbon fiber electrode, about iron exchange membrane, about bipolar plates. Can you share some information to us? How about that goes overseas of China? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I did cover about manufacturing facilities, right? So there is an element of assembly. Stack production is something that battery companies still primarily do themselves. So when I think we say that there's going to be a manufacturing facility to make vanadium batteries, usually included in that is not only assembly of the battery itself, but also manufacturing of at least the stack components. Now, where are they sourcing that material? I think that's a good question. I don't have that level of detail. Whether it's still Chemours, which is a producer, and I don't know exactly how their production looks like. I think that that's a level of insight that would be quite helpful, and I wasn't able to share. But we definitely see a ramp up in production capacity. H2 is ramping up production capacity. VFlow is ramping up production capacity. Sumitomo, I did mention, and I think some like CellCube and Invinity have already done that with investments over the last few years. But that includes assembly of systems as well as manufacturing of the stacks. You're quite right. There are other components, pumps, felts, and things like that. There's not as much information simply because those companies may not necessarily be just dedicated. So they may not announce exactly what they're doing on components directed towards vanadium batteries versus, let's say, components directed towards hydrogen fuel cells. So there's not as much insight yet, just because there's not as much information. But maybe that's something I can work on for the next presentation.
看看还有问题。
Any other questions?
Thank you for your time in the deep light. Okay, my question is, what's the central situation regarding to the resource in South Africa? How about the development of the resource right now in South Africa? And do you think there is any opportunity to the investment in South Africa about the resource area? Thank you.
Yeah. So we are very bullish on the resource capabilities of South Africa, especially because in South Africa you have already two companies that produce vanadium as primary producers, and because the grades are high, that's because the grades are high enough where you can mine vanadium to just get vanadium rather than having to build a steel plant and have vanadium as a co-product. So the grades in what we call the Bushveld complex, well, not everybody calls it that, there's quite a few deposits that could still be exploited. Bushveld itself, for example, has a project in Mokopane. We did pre-feasibility in 2016, and we feel that the economics and the grades are actually better than some of the work that's being done in Australia, for example. So we think that's it's an untapped opportunity. I mean, South Africa used to be the largest vanadium producer in the world. It was decades ago, before China kind of started to dominate a lot of the minerals, and with its own production and processing. But there's definitely a lot of expertise. We think that there's also a lot of facilities that could be retrofitted. And the challenge has been mostly that there's not a lot of support. So Australia was a very good example where the government will give you grants. They've got a more favorable policy towards exploration companies. And so in South Africa, that's a little, that support is not as strong, unfortunately. And we're trying to basically make the government a bit more aware that vanadium is a great opportunity for them in the energy transition, that a lot more vanadium is going to be needed. And I think they're starting to wake up to it, but there's not opposition to it, but there's also not a lot of policy support directly for vanadium. So the answer is, I think, it's a very large resource base, the second or largest, depending on which studies you look at. And the key is it's a very high grade resource base. So, my vision for South Africa is that in the next 10 years, it's growing the amount of mines that are mining vanadium specifically as primary producers. And I just don't see where that's going to happen, outside of South Africa and maybe Australia. And that's going to be a key solution for how we're going to bridge the gap between how much vanadium is produced now and how much we're going to need in 5 to 10 years as vanadium batteries become a big part of the energy storage deployments globally.
再提一个问题，好吧？我们现场。
Here, one more question from side, the lady.
Very nice talk. Thank you. I have one question. There's one slide you're showing that there's many projects and installations all over the world. And I was wondering that for those projects, are they open to all the battery players, like the lithium-ion battery or other battery, or they're only limited to the flow battery? And also the second question is that, can you share any information about the average system cost? Like how many US dollars per kilowatt hour? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the second one, but I have to be careful. Well, yeah, so it's quite a broad range. So the system costs that we've seen in the market right now are anywhere between $600 and $1,000 per kilowatt hour, deployed, installs. That includes your shipping and your installation. And it's for an AC system. So it's really quite a large range. And in fact, we maybe have seen prices kind of not continue to decrease over the last couple of years with the inflationary pressures. So there's not a one number. It's quite a bit of a range. And that's driven by the size, by the supplier, by the kind of guarantees that might be tied to it. So that's what we're seeing in the market. In terms of how the tenders are structured, I do feel that in some cases the vanadium technology is winning bids because their lithium is not permitted in those bids. Certainly, lithium is something that a lot of developers and companies that bid for projects are much more familiar with. So even if you take away the cost question, they tend to be successful because they just have a lot more familiarity. And so you talk to someone, well, can you bid vanadium? And they're like, well, we don't have a lot of experience with it. We want to bid what we're comfortable with, and in a lot of markets that is lithium, especially lithium ferrophosphate. The last few years, but some companies don't want lithium. They may not want it because of safety concerns. They may not want it because they actually want something that is kind of more on the upswing. There's a number of reasons why companies will actually only specify non-lithium technologies. It's not usually only vanadium. I haven't seen, unless they're like a vanadium company, like Bushveld. When we did a tender for our battery, we said it has to be a vanadium battery, but any vanadium battery producer can bid. In the case of like the California long duration tenders, those excluded lithium, but other companies that have long duration technologies, one that have EOS that uses a metal air battery, and they've won some of the amounts. So it's a mix, and you even have these hybrid installations like the one by Invinity in Oxford, which has both a lithium battery and a vanadium battery. And the vanadium battery is there because it's a heavy cycle battery, basically with a use case of almost 3 cycles per day. So that's more of a technical advantage there. So sometimes it's not just excluding lithium, it could actually be hybrid systems where it's part of the solution.
行，我们时间关系，我们现场还有问题吗？
Any other on-site questions? Leo?
Hi. I'm Mr. Mikhail. Thanks for your share of information. I got 2 or 3 questions. May I ask that what's your opinion about what is the maximum cost down of VRB? And I also saw some news about NASA seems to focus on iron chromium flow battery ones. In Canada and Australia focus more on VRB. So, on your opinion, which technical route has theoretically the maximum cost reduction space, or which one has the best cost advantages, judging from the current stage of the progress of mass production, or the
Okay, so maybe let me try. I understood that question is maybe looking at different technologies. Where does vanadium redox flow batteries fit in terms of maybe the cost potential and the cost evolution, especially if we look at other types of flow battery technology. So hopefully that's the question. But that's what I'm going to answer. Well, there are, obviously I focused on the vanadium technology, and as Bushveld, we are focusing on the vanadium technology. And we do that not only because we mine vanadium, but also because we think that long-term the technology has a long runway to be part of the energy storage ecosystem. I don't think that there's going to be one winner. I think there's going to be multiple storage technologies that are going to be needed by the power grid. I think we have a lot of commodities that to only focus on one is going to create a lot of risk. So I think that there needs to be a diversification strategy by regulators, just like we have different generation technologies, even within the renewable energy. We're going to have hydro, we're going to have wind, we're going to have solar. I think we're going to need different types of storage technologies as well. In terms of other flow batteries, I think the challenges that they have is that it's still questionable whether they work. at least with vanadium, we know it works. We can look at a Sumitomo battery that's been operating for 7 years. We can look at a CellCube battery that's been operating for 12 years. I can't even get my phone to last 3 years. So I think that's at least the technical issues in vanadium have been solved, and it is now about the supply chain and the and basically optimization. Whereas with other companies and other technologies, that hasn't been the case. I also feel that in a lot of other flow battery technologies, there's one company or maybe two that promotes a technology rather than dozens as there are with vanadium. There's ESS that does iron flow. There's maybe one other company that does iron flow batteries. People used to use zinc bromine, and there's like one or two companies that still does that. So the challenge there is they don't really have an ecosystem. They don't have dozens of competitors, which is good. They don't have dozens of potential suppliers globally, which is really, really good. So I think that lack of ecosystem for the other flow technologies is going to be an issue, because those companies have to create that entire supply chain themselves. They can't leverage a supplier that might be selling to 10 or 12 different customers the way that vanadium battery companies can. We as an electrolyte producer can sell to Invinity, to CellCube, to Sumitomo, to Shanghai Electric. Someone who's making iron flow electrolyte is probably only doing it to one or two companies, so it's not as exciting to take that risk. But I do feel that there's technology concerns. People focus too much on the capex. They focus too much on the cost of electrolyte, and the rest of the systems in those technologies, while the electrolyte is very cheap, potentially is a lot more expensive, and their performance is worse. So once you add all of that in, I think your lifetime ownership of a non-vanadium based flow battery is actually going to be higher than that of a vanadium based flow battery in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. But
谢谢啊，时间关系，我不得不打断你了。这个我们已经超时很了。有问题还可以通过我们这个组委会再联系啊。我们非常感谢这个 Nikomarov 先生分享的。
Thanks a lot for your sharing. You talk about a lot of info about VRFB outside China. Thanks for your sharing.